Well, for more on this, I'm joined by Gabriel Crouse, International Relations Expert. Gabriel, appreciate your time on this Friday evening. You've obviously listened to President Cyril Ramaphosa speaking about the importance of those relations, our relations with Russia. What's your immediate reaction?
I think that President Ramaphosa is correct to say that South Africa needs to develop its trade relations foremost. We're a very poor country. In a lot of ways, we've been getting poorer, world's highest unemployment rate. That's actually on record. So anything we can do to improve business conditions, incoming investment, outgoing markets for us to sell goods, whether they're resources that we draw straight out of the earth or whether they're value-added materials, either way, that's good for South Africans who are looking for work, and I think the President's right to say that we should be doing that, and that means precisely, looking to do business with Russia, even though Russia is extremely unpopular in Europe, Western Europe, and in the United States and in the UK, and looking to do business with China, and very much, as the President has elsewhere said, looking to do business with the US, the UK, and the EU as well.
Gabriel, decipher this for me, if you will. A lot of the aid or support that comes to Africa comes from the West, right? But you have a summit such as this, which is the second summit, and the West is saying to many African countries, do not go, according to media reports. Russia will not come through on its promises. And then out of the 55 countries that are on the continent, I think almost 50 attend the conference.
Well, I'm not exactly sure on the numbers of attendance. There definitely have been efforts to discourage countries from going. I'm trying to emphasize trade over aid. It is the case that the Western countries, if they'd like to be called that way, have a history of providing aid to Africa. There's conflicting evidence on how well that works. Certainly, there are niche projects where aid can be extremely beneficial. Laying out mosquito nets to stop children, women, people from being bitten and killed. That's extremely helpful. But a lot of aid ends up being counterproductive. Ends up coming with these strings attached that don't add to a transparent and reason-responsive form of democratic value-add government.
Instead, monetary support comes from the West. I mean, you're talking about the Bretton Woods institutions. They're so whether it's the World Bank, IMF, they're all part of that Western enclave, if you will.
Well, if you look at aid, it's all coming from that side. If you look at the Bretton Woods institutions, were particularly well designed to set up some forms of monetary support that I would say go beyond aid. So when the IMF lends countries money, and South Africa was lent money by the IMF during the pandemic, there the idea is not so much that it's aid as like the lender of last resort. And the deal is you get a low interest rate, but you have to play by their rules. If we had a more significant loan from the IMF, we would have more serious budget cuts, where the Treasury has sort of managed to avoid that. In the case of the World Bank, they do lend money in order to do massive infrastructure projects. And South Africa, relative to other countries on the continent, has had very light touch involvement there. Those projects, have the same problems as when China lends money to African countries to roll out infrastructure, which is that if the countries don't pay the money back, when countries are borrowing money from banks, whether it's the World Bank or China, and they don't pay it back, then there's a fundamental sort of question around sovereignty. Because if your friend at school doesn't pay you back, you can go hit him on the head or go grab his lunch or something. When a country doesn't pay you back, it's quite hard to force them. But when you do force them, what you're doing is undermining sovereignty. And that happens across the board. But it's not just Western institutions, the East as well. And if you look at trade, I think technically China's the largest trading partner with South Africa, and certainly the largest with Africa. I think if you look on exports and imports combined, it's over 3 times more of a trading partner than the United States. And that's, partly because it is an economy that in many ways was a lot like an average African economy 40 years ago, and then underwent this massive growth. And so it's not trading in the kind of service-based industries that the UK specializes in, which don't touch with Africa as much. But that's all to say, it's not to say the UK aren't important trading partners as well. I think the idea of this kind of thing, if it's going to work, if it's going to be helpful, is that it shouldn't be either or. It should be more and. From a South African perspective, obviously America doesn't want us to trade with Russia. China doesn't want us to trade with America. But from a South African perspective, we need to be trading with as many other countries as possible. If we do receive aid, it really should, the strings should be minimal and should strictly be there to enforce transparency and to prevent corruption and to make sure that the money gets to the needy. That's, I think, the right way to think about how these things should work. But that's not necessarily how they actually work.
Well, let's look at the other African countries. Now, many of these countries that I've attended, from what we understand, are all wanting to snuggle up to the BRICS group, and this is an opportunity for them to do that. What is the significance of that association, and will it wrestle the initiative from the West?
Yeah, I mean, look, it's complicated. I'm on the record in various places, including a book written by a former colleague called The Rise or Fall of South Africa, as saying that I think that the dollar is probably going to be fundamentally different in 20 years' time. So if you're thinking foreign policy, if you're thinking BRICS, and you're thinking the next 3 years, that seems too short-winded. That's the level of this particular war in Ukraine, and that's what a lot of people focus on. But I think the real big bet is that the United States, if you look at the amount of money its government owes directly and indirectly through unfunded liabilities, the money it owes to pensioners and to healthcare recipients, that it's not really on their accounting books, but when the day comes, people have to start drawing the pension, the government has to pay it out. That, together with the Americans' commitment to being the world's policeman and the amount of money that they are going to need to ramp up in spending on their military, particularly after all the donations that the loans they've been making, the dollar is just looking extremely similar to the pound, sort of in the 60s, or really even more so after the Napoleonic Wars in the 1820s. It looks a lot like the Dutch gulden currency in the 1600s and the early 1630s, the Spanish currency back in the 16th century, in the 1500s. These are all periods where you had a major empire that ruled the world, like America does today, and their currency became the backbone of the global trade, and it allowed that country to borrow a lot of money to run a double deficit, which means they import more than they export. They live very luxurious lifestyles in a service-based world, not as much. They close their own factories and they send those dirty jobs overseas. That's really how things have played out again and again through history. And what tends to happen in the end is that currency bubble bursts. But it's not like if one company's stock goes up or down. It's not even like if a normal country goes up or down. It's much more exciting to understate it. And it could be much worse would be much worse than the global financial crisis, for example. Now, the BRICS idea is to prepare for that and for African countries to be able to get ahead of that, for them not to sink when the bubble explodes, but instead for them to be able to ride the waves of opportunity that come out of that. But the timing is complicated, and that's why, again, the right play is to have probably a foot in both boats and wait and see where things go, but to try and avoid being overcommitted one side, overcommitted the other side.
Well, I'm glad you raised the issue of 1 foot in, 1 foot out, because it seems to be a challenge that's maybe not bedeviling President Cyril Ramaphosa, but is a point of contention for many of his detractors, and that's around AGOA. And the fact that AGOA gave us, I think, $2.7 billion worth of trade with the United States in the last financial year, if not the previous year. So it's an important trading mechanism, if you will, for South Africa. But President Cyril Ramaphosa has clearly stated that he will not be bullied into drawing a line in the sand with his relationship with Russia. Is AGOA compromised, do you think, from what's going on at this Russia-Africa summit?
Well, I've got a very controversial view on this. I think that by not inviting Russia's president, Vladimir Putin, to come into South Africa, South Africa has more or less guaranteed that it is going to keep AGOA. And Minister Ibrahim Patel, who's, this is right in his department, has said that he's going to apply for an expedited extension of South Africa's AGOA trade position. And I actually have spoken to a source who's in Washington, D.C. right now, who says that it's looking pretty good for South Africa to get that extension. So, yeah, it's not a very big trade deal. It's an important one, particularly because of how value add the commodities are, like motor vehicles being manufactured on the coast in Pretoria. But I think the thing is that if you look at the actual terms of AGOA, we might still be kicked out. And that's because AGOA says that countries have to be liberalizing their markets, making them more free in order to belong. And South Africa is, looking to enforce expropriation without compensation with the expropriation bill, to have water quotas based on race, to reintroduce race into home affairs qualifications. But really, if you just look at the expropriation bill, former American administrations, Obama said that he was going to kick South Africa out of AGOA just because we wanted to put up a tariff on chicken imports. That's a minor incursion on the free market. When you actually go out and say, look, we're going to take property without paying the owner anything at all, that's a major incursion into free markets. Where America has dealt with countries like that before, Cuba, Venezuela, etc., it has punished them harshly. It seems to me like it's most likely that South Africa is going to be kicked out of AGOA. The tragedy is we shouldn't be kicked out of AGOA. America should be saying clearly, guys, don't do this. Don't pass this law. And that way you can stay trading freely. And we think it's a good idea. It's good for your own country. If you do pass it, that's your own business. We're going to kick you out of AGOA. Unfortunately, that message hasn't been sent. And so I think we're going to get the worst of all worlds, where the South Africans think they can get away with it, and they're going to pass it, and then they're not going to get away with it, but we're only going to be kicked out a year or two down the line. At that point in time, we're going to have a lack of investment because of the expropriation, and then on top of it, lack of trade because of being kicked out of AGOA. It's really the worst of all worlds, and it's kind of a result of the fact that people have been asleep at the wheel on this particular issue because they've been so focused on Ukraine, Russia, the war, all that other stuff, which is important to global trade, but it's not nearly as important to South Africans as basic property rights, as basic free trade, as our need to grow the jobs market for all of the people that are unemployed in this country.
Gabriel Crouse, appreciate your time this evening, international relations expert.